So, good evening, everybody. And once again, we are back with day 8 of this initiative of Civils Daily called Daily Answer Wars and Daily Answer Wars Prime, where we do the practice of answer writing for the purpose of UPSC mains. So, now again in the morning, we had given you a question in the Telegram group, and I think some of you have attempted it. And in this session, we will be trying to dissect that question, understand the framework for writing the answer to that question, and then go on to talking about some of the copies that you have submitted and find out what all we could have improved in our answer writing and what all we are doing good. So the question was related to GS3. One of the topics in GS3, if you go through the syllabus, you find will exclusively mentioned is about food processing industry. So this topic is exclusively mentioned as a separate point in GS3 syllabus, and almost every year we see a question related to this industry in the GS3 paper. So this year's question was quite simple, I will say, because it was a very broad question. The challenge was just to limit it inside the word limit and write a crisp answer within 10 so that you can finish it within 2 pages. So the question was elaborate the scope and significance of the food processing industry in India. So just you needed to write about the scope and significance. The question was not complex any bit because it was clearly mentioned that you wanted to that they wanted to know about the scope and the significance of the food processing industry in India. So you had just to paper the answer with some data wherever possible, like what is the current status of the food processing industry and what all it can achieve. And then finally, after writing these two parts separately, for example, the scope and the significance, you had to write a way forward, like what should be the way forward for our government or our country as a whole to move in this direction, and then you had just to conclude the answer. So that was the basic framework. We will see what we could have written in the answer, like content wise, and then we will move on to looking at the copies that you have submitted in the Telegram group. Good evening, Varsha. Good evening, Harji. So the question was about food processing. So the in introduction, we just start with talking about this industry. The food processing industry is called sunrise industry. Now you must know about sunrise industry. There are some industry which have risen recently and are in nascent stages of growth. So such industries are called sunrise industry, and it has a large growth potential in terms of employment, export capacity, and manufacturing GDP. So as our according to our trends, we tried to mention some of the data points here. So manufacturing GDP 14% means it contributes to 14% of the manufacturing GDP, not the total GDP. Next, we are talking about employment. So currently, it employs almost 20 lakh plus employees, and it is expected to grow further as the industry becomes bigger and more stronger. Next, about the export capacity. So 13% of Indian exports. Now this sector is also going to have a great impact in export capacity in future because uh, many Indian products are being liked in foreign countries, and if we process them and package them properly, I think export capacity of this industry is also pretty big. So on those lines, we just introduced this answer, and next we will talk about scope of food processing industry in India. Now, scope means like what is the potential. For example, we if you listen in common day terms, like people will say you what is the scope of doing this course or scope of engineering, scope of medicine. So that is basically the scope of food processing. So basically, they are asking the potential of food processing industry in India, like. According to India's materials that we have or resources we have, what where all food processing industry can go or can reach, you had to analyze that. So first point is about raw material. So India is one of the largest producers of meat, second largest producer of fruit and vegetables. So amongst in the world, so it has a huge production of cereals also. So raw materials will not be an issue. And recently we have also become self-sufficient in food security. So we can again use our excess food grains to supply uh, to the food processing industry so that they can process those food grains or cereals for export purposes. So you can talk about this raw material. Next, one of the most common points is market. Now you understand that since we have such a huge domestic population, so of course our market is very large, and that itself means that there is a lot of scope for food processing industry in India. Next, you can talk about changed consumption patterns. So, if you analyze, you will understand that consumption pattern in recent times is pretty different than what it used to be, and this is basically due to social changes. For example, urbanization, or you can say nuclearization of families. or you can say like more female workforce going to work. So that, for example, we consume more packed food products now. For example, Maggie, pasta, these are all packed food products. So you can understand that due to urbanization and many such social factors, consumption patterns for this industry has been changing, and that is a pretty much advantage for this food processing industry. So, due to urbanization, changes in the gender composition of workforce and growing consumption rates has increased demand for processed food. Next is about increase in incomes. Now, yesterday we were talking about increase in incomes due to market economy. So, incomes have increased, especially after the LPG reforms. Like many people have been taken out of poverty in India. Yesterday we talked about the data, and also that also means that disposable incomes in the hands of the people are increasing. And if the incomes will increase, of course, they will try to increase their uh, quality of food intake. So that also means that the food processing industry has a scope there because of increase in incomes. Next is about export opportunities. Export opportunities we discussed, like proximity to key export destinations, greater integration with the global economy acts as an added advantage to expand the sector. Again, after 91 reforms, globalization has been in full strength. So there is a lot of opportunities to export. India has been one of the biggest exporters of food products, and we have a positive trade balance with even countries like USA. So we do have a great amount of export opportunities. So you can write this point. Next, increased demand for processed food. So again, this is basically about those factors only. You can avoid it if you are like short on space, but if you want to write, you can just include it also. Investments. So FPI currently attracts a mere 6% of our total industrial investment. Now, food processing industry also is getting a lot of investment from foreigners and like foreign direct investment. So that also makes this industry pretty attractive growth wise. So it is estimated that investment will be double in next 10 years, and there is a huge potential for this industry to grow. So you can talk about that. Next is about proactive government policy and support. So here you can just mention some of the government schemes or government initiatives that we see in recent times. Try to use your knowledge, prelims knowledge about schemes and all here, and insert some of the schemes. For example, you can talk about mega food parks, PM Sampada Yojana. Then there was that Operation Greens and all such schemes have been there for the food processing industry. And you can say that since the government is also focusing on this sector, so there is a pretty much scope of more investments and more growth and increment in the food processing industry itself. So these were the basic points you needed to write about the scope. So I think you could have just got these points through brainstorming a bit, because you just needed to understand that what is the potential of food processing industry, and you just needed to think very basic, like what all are the raw materials, what is the market. So if you read that geography section, and there if you read about industries, so that will also help you in like answering this question, because these are some of the factors that influence industrial locations also. So you can get some idea from there also and incorporate it in your answer. So you just had to write 4 5 points. It was not necessary to mention all of these, but you just needed to make it clear that we have a lot of scope for food processing industry in India. So if you could have added some data and all, it would have been advantageous. Otherwise, you could have just mentioned these points. Next, we can move on to talking about significance of the food processing industry. So this part I have divided into two parts. For example, significance can be divided into economic significance and social significance. Now again, you can use a table to sort in your answer and make it better presentable. But here, since I was just not short of space, and also I was just writing all those points. For example, in economic significance, you can talk about revival of economic growth. So here you can also insert the angle of pandemic, like we have seen subdued growth in the recent uh, past, but the food processing industry has a compound annual growth rate of around 11%. So that is a lot of CAGR, like very high CAGR. So that means CAGR means basically compound annual growth rate. So revival of economic growth can be based on the food processing industry, or it can just help in reviving the economic growth after especially the pandemic, like pandemic disturbances. Now it also contributes 1.69% of the total gross value added for India. So you can also mention this in the introduction. We have also mentioned, so that is fine. You can just ignore it also if you don't really remember it, but just try to mention one or two data points. For example, you could have just mentioned this CAGR of around 11%, because this is quite a high CAGR. Next, we can talk about again employment. So this sector provides a lot of employment both in the organized and unorganized sector. So that is greatly significant due to job creation done by this sector. So you can talk about that. Over 16% of the total workforce in the organized sector and 32% in the unorganized manufacturing sector are employed in the food processing industries. Next, we can talk about controlling food inflation. So we are talking about economic significance here. So try to think along those lines. For example, employment, inflation, agriculture, crop diversification, value addition. So these are basically economic things that should just come to your mind when you are writing economic significance of anything basically. So when we are talking about inflation, if FPI next, you can also mention about reducing post-harvest losses. So, like in India, there is a lot of problem of storage, etc. Like we are lacking in cold storage capacity. So you will see that food is rotting in the FCI godowns because they don't have proper capacities to store the grains. So at present, post-harvest losses in India are estimated to be around 16 billion US dollar. So that is a significant number, represents a significant loss of national wealth. And if this instead of storing it or trying to use it afterwards, if you can channel this towards the food processing industry, they can help in reducing our post harvest losses. So economically again it will become beneficial or significant. Next, you can also talk about diversification of crops. Here you can talk about that wheat paddy combined system. We can just move on to diversification of crops if food processing industry is well developed, because then farmers will be able to diversify their crops and sell them to these industries, and then they can use it to export or sell it in the domestic market itself after processing those different cereals other than rice and wheat. So you can talk about this. Next is about value addition. So this is the primary function of food processing industry. So with value addition in processing, the income of farmers can be increased, which help in achieving the goal of doubling farmers' income. So these are basically some of the economic significances you could have mentioned. Most important being growth, employment, inflation, and reducing of losses and diversification of crops. I think these three, four first points were quite important, and you should have written this. Next, we can also talk about the social significance. Social significance means on the lives of people or on the lives of the societal lives of people. How does food processing industries have an impact, or what is the significance of FPIs on social lives of people? So first and foremost, it reduces malnutrition. For example, we hear about the food, need of making food fortified. We need of introducing more vitamins and minerals in food products. So processed foods, when fortified with vitamins and minerals, can reduce the nutritional gap in the population. So you can talk about this. Next, here again, you can talk about reduce food wastage. So food wastage, there is a lot of food wastage at both the farm level and at the plate level. Like even if you go in the parties and all, or even if you see in marriage functions, a lot of food is wasted. So instead of channeling a lot of food there, or that excess of food can be channeled towards the food processing industry, and that will reduce the food wastage. Next, we can talk about enhancing consumer choices. So it allows food from other parts of the world to be transported to our local market and vice versa, increasing food choices for consumers. For example, you can see there in India also, after globalization, we see a lot of different food products or processed food products from different countries that Indian people have developed a taste for. So that certainly enhances the consumer choices. Next, you can again talk about gender empowerment. So, food processing industry is closely related to any animal husbandry, where many women workers are employed. You can just talk about employment of women workers, because this will again give an opportunity for women to get employed. Next, you can also talk about reduced migration. So, if their food processing industries are established in like tier 2 or tier 3 cities, so of course migration will stop as people will get employment in their cities only. Next, this can also be a tool of poverty alleviation, because again, if the food processing industries are established in rural areas, so that rural economy can get a boost, and rural poverty alleviation and empowerment will be there. So these are some of the important points. Here again, you could have mentioned three, 4 points. Again, poverty, gender empowerment, uh, food malnutrition. So these are some very basic points whenever you think about societal issues. So you could have just linked it to food processing industry, and that should have been sufficient for this answer. Next, I have seen some of the copies, and you have mentioned other things like challenges and all. So that was not required. If you had a lot of space and all, you could have mentioned again in a smart art format, like drawing a flowchart and all. But I don't think you had the scope here. This was just a 10 marker, and if you just write the scope and significance, give some data points, give some examples, talk about some of the government schemes, use the keywords, then I don't think you had any scope to write about challenges and all. So if you had, you could have written, but I don't think it was very advisable. Next, you could just mention some way forward, like what we all can do and what the government has been doing to revive this industry or like promote this industry. So there was a committee called Surjit Bhalla Committee, which was formed. So it focused on internationalization of standards of food processing. Like many of our food exports are rejected because of lack of some non-tariff barriers, for example, phytosanitary measures or hygiene measures, basically. So this committee was basically formed, and it looked after internationalization of those standards and making products export ready. And that should also be the priority of government. We should not be rejected because of these hygiene factors or like non-tariff barriers. Next, in way forward, you can talk about policy measures. So streamlining the regulatory structure, labor law, food and packaging standards again. Financial measures, so you can talk about providing appropriate tax incentives to those who want to invest in such industries, or giving them some tax holidays for say 1 or 2 years for setting up such food processing industries. Next, you can also talk about plugging supply side and infrastructure bottlenecks through farmer, producer, investor, and lab linkages. So these are the main key points in a food processing industry. The raw material will come from farmer, producer will produce, like process it, investor will give the money, and the lab will give the technology and the research and development for processing a particular food product. So these are the linkages that the government as an intermediary needs to establish and provide infrastructure for to help prosper this industry. Next, you can talk about skilled manpower and reorienting stakeholders' mindset towards demand and profit. So, skilled manpower will again be able to use the technological tools pretty well, and that will again lead to more employment and more profit and demand for processed food. So, you can talk about that also. So, this was the basic way forward. Again, here also you could have just reduced some of the points, but I think these are some very basic points that you could have thought of and written in the exam hall. Next, we can just conclude that the food processing industry is critical for the country's faster economic growth, poverty reduction, employment generation, exports, development of region, and doubling farmer income. So this is just a summary of what I have written in the above part, and you can also just do the same. If you wanted to again mention, you can also mention some of the government schemes here and say that so and so schemes have been doing well, and the government needs to fine tune these schemes or make these schemes more implementable or write something on those lines, a bit futuristic, and use some schemes to justify your conclusion. So this was the basic framework for today's answer. I think you must have got it. So basically, the demand of the question was threefold: writing about scope, writing about significance, introduction, conclusion, and a small way forward. So I think that was the basic framework this answer required. And if you could have written all of this, you should have certainly scored some decent marks. Now we will move to looking at some of the copies. And first of all, we will move to Varsha's copy. Good evening, Satyendra. Varsha, sir, Varsha, not necessary. I think in 10 markers, they are not asking challenges, so that is not necessarily required. If you are just able to write significance, scope, and way forward in decent amount of like points, I think that was sufficient. If it was a 15 marker, you could have written challenges. So elaborate the scope and significance of the food processing industry. So you can also see that the keyword here is just elaborate. So whenever you get these keywords, na elaborate or elucidate, you don't need to go into a lot of different different dimensions of the answer. You just need to uh, be very practical and elaborate what they are asking to elaborate, or just expand upon what they are asking. So here they are basically asking the scope and significance. So I think elaborate was the keyword. So you just needed to expand upon it. So if they had given discuss, then we could have thought of writing some of the constants, because that means that they wanted to holistically know about like all the dimensions of food processing industry. So when they are asking to discuss, you can also, for example, some people will say, like some economists who want to criticize food processing industry will criticize it, and they will say that no, the scope is not much, and hence these are the drawbacks that the industry is facing. So I don't think that the scope is there is a lot of scope. Then in that case, you need to write like both dimensions. What is the scope? What are the positive arguments for the increasing scope, and what are the negative arguments? Like what are the challenges? So, but here they are just asking to elaborate. So I don't think challenges was required. You could just expand upon scope and significance and be done with it. So the Indian food sector ranks fifth in terms of contributing 6% GDP, 13% of Indian exports, and 6%. Okay, fine. Scope and significance. I think I'm not going into details of the data right now. I just ensure it that it is correct, because I think multiple sources have some variations in data and it is not possible to like correct it. But overall, I think you have written well, and that is a decent introduction. Scope and significance of food processing industry in India. Huge employment generation according to SOCHAM. Okay. So you have just mentioned, I think, scope and significance joint. Therefore, I think you must have written challenges. Yes, yeah. So I think it is better to write this scope and significance uh, differently, because both are a bit different things. Scope means what is the potential of something, like how all it can grow, what is the highest it can go to. So that is the scope. Whereas significance is how it is creating a difference in the lives of people. So that is significance. Significance is more related to the present situation, whereas scope is a bit futuristic. I hope you are understanding that. Significance means how the society is affected right now, or how it is affecting the economy right now. So what is the significance of that industry? So that you need to write in significance. Whereas in scope you have the uh, advantage of getting a bit rhetorical and talking about very uh, a bit futuristic, and talk about expand upon more things that will happen in future, or that the industry can go to. So I hope you are getting this difference between scope and significance. Huge employment generation. So this is okay. Like recently, for example, in this point, if I explain to you the difference, huge employment generation, the significance of this is that the quality of life of those people who are employed is improving. So that is the significance of employment generation. Whereas the scope is that this employment generation can again increase as the industry increases or grows. So that is the scope. Whereas the significance is the current impact on the lives of the people who are employed. So you could have just differentiated these two parts and moved on. So huge employment generation, fine. Inflow of FDIs, food processing sector, okay. Huge demand, Indian food and growth, okay. So I think these are all points related to mostly scope. Ample raw material, India being the largest milk producer, okay. Second largest export-led growth, huge foreign exchange generator, fine. Woman-centric employment as a labor-intensive industry demands various skill sets possessed by women. Okay. So I think this point is more about significance next. Woman centric is it is employing more women right now. In future, what will happen? Like it is not going to be 100% women. So that is there. It won't grow. It will be almost what is now a bit more or less. But the significance is that it is creating a difference in lives of multiple women, both at the rural and urban level. So this is the point that is more related to significance. Whereas these points, for example, export, raw material, market, demand, so these are points that are more related to the potential of the growth or the scope of the food processing industry. So this part could have been divided and written, and I think the points that I mentioned you could have added those points, divided the significance in economic and societal part, and talked about scope regarding the broader points. Challenges: inadequate links between, okay. Challenges related to logistics is okay. Lack of applied research, inadequate cold storage and warehousing, lack of access to credit, numerous legislative and administrative delays. Okay. So I think challenges are fine, but again, I will say that without explaining the first part, there was no utility of writing it in detail. What you could have done is, like yesterday, you were drawing the flowcharts. In that manner only, you could have just drawn a circle and given these points in very brief somewhere in the side of your answer copy. Next, we talk about way forward improvement in logistics sector. Okay, incentivize operators, skill training in food processing industry, preliminary post harvest treatment, produce. Okay, enforcement. Okay, startups to increase fine. Food processing industry holds a huge untapped potential. It should be. So this is fine. Conclusion is also good, and way forward is also decent. But I think the body of the answer needs some more content. Like both parts can be differentiated, and try to use the a bit more data, and some schemes like government schemes in the field of food processing can be used to emphasize that the scope of this industry is a lot, because even the government is launching a host of schemes. For example, you can then talk about PM Sampada Yojana and all of that, mega food park schemes, Operation Greens and all of that. So mention those schemes, try to improve upon this body. Otherwise, I think overall you have structured the answer well, Just the challenges part can be shortened a bit. So overall, I think out of 10, you will get 3.5 for this answer, Varsha. Next, we move to Harji's copy. Elaborate the scope and signal. Okay, India's food processing is one of the largest in the world and its output expected to okay, fine. Scope of food processing in India. India is agriculture prosperous nation, fine. Okay. Materials, processed foods are less likely to get rotten, okay. India holds the sixth largest food and grocery market, okay. So you can see like these are points that all of them are have probability to we have the probability to become better at, like availability of raw materials, increasing exports, uh, retail sales, or like grocery market. Like we are a great market because of our population, so we have the scope of improving. So these are some good points which you can write in scope of the industry. With help of food processing industry, Indian farmers will be able to directly sell their crops to industry for better output. Total horticulture, okay, decent point, but I think this is more again about significance. Total horticulture production in 20 is estimated to be okay. India, the food sector has emerged as a high growth and high profit sector. Okay, significance according to food processing industry, the food processing industry fine. Food processing is the most sustainable development. Share of okay, more than 5 million workers. Fine. Food processing in India includes fruits and vegetables. So here you could have added some social challenges also. I think economic challenges are mostly mentioned good, but I think it is again very data rich. So thoda sa you can just give some analytical points also rather than keeping on writing data, because at one point the examiner will get bored of reading all that data and write two or three important data points. For example, you can talk about contribution to GDP, contribution to exports, employment. So that is decent enough. After that, you can just mention about some points. For example, uh, it can help in easing the food inflation. It can help in crop diversification. So these are some analytical points that you can also mention in the significance part. So try to implement those points also rather than just mentioning the data points. And next, you can also talk about social significance, where you can talk about reduction in poverty and then malnutrition and then gender empowerment. So all of those dimensions you can bring in the answer in this part. Next, challenges. Again, challenges not required, but fine, you have mentioned. So just try to keep it short. No need to explain. Just give this arrows and mention climatic condition, lack of technology, infrastructure deficiency, and that should be it. Government initiatives try to integrate in the answer itself. Try to use your knowledge to uh, write according to what is being asked in the answer, so that the examiner uh, gets impressed that you have tried to use your knowledge in sticky and still have stuck to the point. If you write separately, they will think that you just know these and you want to show your knowledge. Therefore, you are writing government initiatives because they are not asking it. So you can just mention these schemes in the scope that the government has also been proactive and introduced a host of schemes. For example, this, and this, and that indicates that we have a lot of scope in this industry. There is a lot of scope in food processing sector in India, and its growth will help in employment generation in doubling. Okay, fine. Introduction, conclusion is good. And overall, I think other than these two parts that were not really required, I think most of the answer is fine. Uh, while talking about significance, you could have mentioned social significance also and given some more analytical points in this part. Other than that, the introduction and this part of your answer, that is the scope, is decent enough. I think you will get good marks for that. So overall, 4 marks out of 10 you will get, Harji, for this answer. Uh, if you could have written the second part of the answer a bit better, I think you must have got 4.5 or 5 in this answer. So that is it for today, guys. Again, we will meet tomorrow with a new session, and a new question will be posted in the morning. Try to answer that, and we will again come in the evening with the evaluation and feedback session and try to discuss what all you have in the answers in the Telegram group. So thank you very much, and again we will meet tomorrow. Sir, in significance, we can mention increase in disposable income also, right, as quality of life. Uh, yes, of course, since employment increases, so disposable income will also increase or quality of life improves. That is what I have written in that point. Increasing consumer choices. So when your disposable income will increase, then only your choices, you will be able to make choices. Otherwise, if you are poor and if you have a limited amount of money, you don't have the choices. So I've tried to link those points. Harji, thank you. Okay, so thank you very much. We will meet again tomorrow. Happy answer writing and keep on practicing. I think keep the Josh high and also try to do some peer reviews in the group so that you can also learn from the answers of other people. Thank you very much.